It's been over 50 years since the last time humans have set foot on the moon. Since then, we've made enormous strides in technologies and our ability to live and work in space. But we haven't been back to the moon. While NASA currently targets September 2026 for the first landing of a lunar crewed mission since the Apollo program, that date does not seem very reliable. In the meantime, other countries, and most importantly several private entities, have announced their own plans to send their own missions to the moon. We are at the dawn of a new space race, and we have to ask, who will win? NASA? China? Someone else? Let's find out. It is true that crewed missions to the moon are expensive, difficult, and dangerous. And we now have a long history going back decades of reliable, dependable, capable, robotic exploration, including flybys, orbiters, landers, and rovers. Why don't we look at how much human spaceflight would cost to return to the moon and just spend that money on lots of robots instead? The answer is that no matter how dependable and how capable our little robotic explorers are, they just can't match what a human can do. Compared to a robot, a human is stronger, at least stronger than the kinds of robots we can send to the moon. A human can troubleshoot and solve problems much faster without guidance from Earth-based engineers. And humans are much more creative and flexible when it comes to scientific investigation. And lastly, humans are much faster moving around, and they're much more versatile and dexterous. I mean, a typical rover speed is around 0.1 miles per hour, or a blazing 152 meters per hour. Insert obligatory joke about old people driving on freeways here. Humans are just better in almost every aspect. The typical benchmark is that what a robot can do in an entire day, a human can accomplish in a minute. But the downsides, of course, are that sending humans is much more expensive and much riskier. Except for a few engineers, nobody sheds a tear when a robot crash lands on the surface. And a crewed mission is going to be at least 10 times more expensive than an equivalent robotic mission. But while human missions are more expensive, their productivity totally eclipses that. The Apollo mission spent a total of 12.5 contact days on the moon, which resulted in nearly 3,000 scientific papers. Compare that to the 1,000 or so papers written about Mars from years of rovers and landers on its surface. On a cost per science result basis, we're stupid to not keep sending humans into space. But science isn't the only reason to send humans to the moon. The moon has a lot of easily accessible resources that could provide the basis for space-based industry. Mining and manufacturing on the moon could use rich deposits in methane, ammonia, and atomic oxygen in the lunar regolith. These operations could funnel back either manufactured or refined materials to the Earth, or become the backbone of further off-world industry as a steady supply of water and fuel. The moon has a much shallower gravitational well than the Earth, meaning that it's easier to come and go from the surface. You could build advanced rocket parts or habitats and get them out to Mars or the asteroid belt or anywhere else in the solar system far easier than doing the same thing on the Earth. And while for now we can fantasize about fully automated factories or mining operations on the lunar surface, the truth is that we don't have nearly the experience or expertise to develop those kinds of systems outside of the Earth. Lunar manufacturing and mining is a long way off. We have to figure out how mining and machining can operate in low gravity. We have to figure out how to deal with all the superfine lunar dust. We have to figure out how to haul all that mining gear out there, and we have to figure out where all the good stuff is on the moon in the first place. Otherwise, we'll waste our time digging up just more regolith.
That's a rock.
So to kickstart this process, we're going to need a lot of humans doing a lot of grunt work. Lastly, it's just fun. Humans are natural explorers. Long ago, we expanded into every habitable biome of the Earth, making our way across ice bridges and over the horizons of endless seas to find new homes. It's in our nature to explore and expand. The moon is right there, waiting for us. We spent millennia thinking it was just a mysterious part of the heavens. Now we understand that it's a world in its own right, a place to plant our flags and build our homes, a place where a branch of humanity could potentially create communities. There is always going to be a segment of the population that desperately wants to go to the moon just for the adventure of it and the desire for a new life.
It's manifest destiny.
It's not crazy to imagine humanity building cities and homesteads on the lunar surface. It may take a very long time, but it's not impossible. If those people are private individuals spending their own money, then good for them. If it's publicly funded institutions like NASA footing the bill, then let's keep in mind that the entire space program of the United States takes up less than 1% of the total federal budget. In other words, we're barely spending any money on it at all. We're going to the moon. But who's going to get there first? The frontrunner in this new space race is, of course, NASA. They're the only organization to have even done it before in the first place. That was 50 years ago. And while all the technology of the Apollo program still exists in the form of blueprints and designs, all the human expertise that went into crafting those rockets and spaceships is now either retired or passed away. Besides, we're not spending nearly as much money on the modern space program than we were in the 1950s and 60s. And to be quite frank, the Apollo missions were outright dangerous. They had a level of risk that is completely unacceptable to modern standards. When the Apollo 1 disaster happened, killing 3 astronauts during a launch dress rehearsal in 1967, NASA paused human spaceflight for less than 2 years. An event like that today would likely shut down programs for at least a decade. Today, NASA has plans to return to the moon. Dubbed the Artemis project, the first crewed mission profile, which is currently slated for no earlier than 2026, looks like this. First, a launch will send the lunar lander craft into Earth orbit. A private company, either SpaceX or Blue Origins, will provide this craft. To get the lander to the moon, it will need to be refueled, which will take somewhere in the ballpark of 10 to 20 additional launches, rendezvous in orbit, and refueling. Alternatively, there might be a tanker in orbit that is already pre-filled. The lander will then burn and get itself into lunar orbit and wait. Additional lunar landers may be sent to deliver supplies to the lunar surface for later use. Then, NASA's newest rocket, the Space Launch System, or SLS, will send the Orion spacecraft into orbit. The Orion spacecraft will then carry 4 astronauts into a lunar orbit, taking 2 to 3 days to reach the moon. The Orion spacecraft will dock with the lunar lander. 2 astronauts will descend on the lunar lander and spend roughly a week at or near the lunar south pole. Then they will get back in the lunar lander, launch up, rendezvous with Orion, ditch the lander, and return to Earth, splashing down in some handy large body of water. That's quite a complex mission plan, much more complex than the original Apollo missions of the last century. The reasons for that complexity are that the Artemis project is operating in a much more difficult political environment, meaning there's not as much broad support for the space program anymore. Another reason is the fact that the Artemis missions will be much longer and more scientifically in-depth than Apollo, and these missions will set the stage for a longer-term and even permanent human presence on the moon. That said, everyone agrees that the projected launch date of 2026 is, let's just say it's optimistic. The Orion spacecraft is having some weird heat shield issues, which is critical for its survival when it descends through the atmosphere on its way back home, and NASA is currently debating if the next Artemis launch should be uncrewed so it can have another test. The SLS launcher itself is slow and difficult to build, and relies on solid rocket boosters, which are notoriously finicky. The best way I can describe it is that solid rocket boosters are like overpowered Roman candle fireworks. One little thing goes wrong and well, your 4th of July party is going to involve a visit to the emergency room. The private partners aren't exactly keeping to their timelines either. At the time of this episode, Blue Origins hasn't even gotten a spacecraft into orbit, let alone demonstrated a viable moon lander. As for SpaceX, they are in the midst of testing their Starship, which will serve as the basis for their lunar lander. Starship tests seem to be going well, but they don't have the lunar lander part settled yet. Space is hard. In the 1960s, the United States was able to accomplish it by spending nothing less than a staggering amount of money. The Apollo program spent over $260 billion of today's dollars just to send a couple dozen people to the lunar surface. Missions to the moon are exceedingly complex, requiring launching, traveling, landing, surface activities, launching again, returning, and landing back on the Earth. This isn't just some orbital joyride. This is on the very edge of what humanity is capable of. Meanwhile, other nations have already begun their own projects. Take the China National Space Agency, for example, with their CLEP, or Chinese Lunar Exploration Program. If you have any doubts about the objectives of the program, just check out their logo. It's a stylized crescent moon with 2 footprints in the middle. By the way, the logo is meant to also resemble the Chinese character for moon, which is pretty clever in my opinion. Now, as we've seen with NASA and Artemis, plans are easy to announce but slightly harder to execute. That said, the Chinese have managed quite a few accomplishments in a short period of time. On October 24, 2007, the Chinese launched the Chang'e 1 mission, named for the traditional goddess of the moon. This was the first launch of Phase 1 of the plan, which focused solely on orbital missions. The orbiter was a success, providing a detailed map of the entire lunar surface and doing some long-range scouting for future landing sites. That mission was followed 3 years later with the appropriately named Chang'e 2, which did the same thing but in greater detail. Then it sped off to visit the asteroid 4179 Tutatis to help the agency test its communications and command systems. In 2013, the Chinese upped the ante with Chang'e 3. Can you pick out a pattern here? Which was the first soft landing on the moon achieved by that agency. That mission too was a great success, especially with the deployment of a small, cute little rover named U2. In fact, that mission was so successful that it delayed the launch of Chang'e 4 because they wanted to add more capabilities to it. That mission launched on January 3, 2019 and reached the South Pole Aitken Basin on the far side of the moon. It also carried another rover with it, U2-2, the first ever rover to explore the far side. Next up was Phase 3, a pair of robotic sample return missions. The first of these missions was just a test, and the second one, Chang'e 5, launched in November 2020 and returned to Earth with 1,731 grams of lunar soil, the first samples to return to Earth since the Apollo era. The latest mission is, you guessed it, Chang'e 6, which launched on May 3, 2024. This mission was a whole package: a lander back at the South Pole Aitken Basin, a successful sample return of more lunar material, and a new rover, the Jinchan, to explore the far side some more because we just can't get enough of that far side. While these are all great successes, they were all uncrewed robotic missions. The next in the series, Chang'e 7, expected to launch in 2026, and Chang'e 8, 2 years later, will begin to set the stage for human presence, developing a sort of robotic base of landers and rovers, with orbiters monitoring the whole thing and relaying communications back and forth to Earth. All of this is to test one of the most important aspects of a future lunar base, ISRU. ISRU is an acronym that you'll hear a lot about when it comes to future plans for the moon, Mars, and beyond, and it stands for In Situ Resource Utilization. The basic idea is that launching stuff to the moon is expensive. Really expensive. And if we want any sort of base or installation there, it would require an enormous amount of resources like air, water, food, and structures to make it happen. So a more clever approach is to use lunar soil or regolith to fabricate structures and pull out useful resources like water. It's not like we could just 3D print a lunar base out of regolith, but the more we're able to use local resources, the better our prospects for future long-term habitation. After this, things start to get a little fuzzy with the Chinese plans. They've announced that they want to send a human mission to the moon in 2029 or 2030. The mission will require a much beefier launch vehicle than their current capabilities, named the Long March 10, which is currently in development. Think of it like the Chinese version of the SLS or Atlas V, a single-use vehicle designed to throw as much as possible at the moon. The current plans call for this rocket to be capable of lofting 70 tons into low Earth orbit and sending 27 tons towards the moon. Even with this kind of lift capacity, however, the hypothetical crewed mission will still require 2 launches, one for the lander and another for the spacecraft to take the crew to the moon. That crew would land on the surface, spend a few days poking around and looking at rocks. I'm just kidding, maybe doing some intense flight testing and science, and then return. A retread of the Apollo-style missions for sure, but a retread is better than what we have right now, which is nothing. So good for them. All of the components of that mission, the spacecraft, the lander, the spacesuits, all of it are still under active development. Chinese space officials and leaders tend to keep their cards close to their chest, and it's not like NASA where the budget undergoes regular public reviews. On the other hand, it's pretty difficult, as in impossible, to keep launches and space activity secret. So we know when the Chinese are able to accomplish something, but we don't know if programs are over budget or facing major delays or technical hurdles. It's anybody's guess if that expected launch date of 2029 or 2030 is reliable or not. When it comes to the Chinese, we'll just have to wait and see. But the United States and China aren't the only powerful, wealthy nations in the world, and they're certainly not the only nation active in space. For example, there are the Russians, which are kind of distracted at the moment, so for our purposes, there really isn't much to talk about there. It seems these days that everybody wants to get a piece of the moon for themselves, and many nations have either developed their own independent spacecraft or took up some rideshare options available on the heavy lift vehicles available from the United States and China. In 2007, JAXA, the Japanese space agency, launched a successful orbiter mission right around the same time that the Chinese were gearing up Chang'e 1. Followed in 2008 by the Indian Space Agency's Chandrayaan-1 mission, which was mostly an orbiter but also technically landed on the moon because that mission included an impactor that crashed on purpose on the lunar surface. In 2014, we had, wait for it, Luxembourg joining the party with the Manfred Memorial Moon mission, which is a bit of a mouthful, named after the founder of the private company that led the mission who passed away in 2014. This mission rode along with the Chang'e 5 on a Long March 3C rocket, and it successfully flew by the moon before entering an orbit that would end up sending the spacecraft crashing into the lunar surface in 2022. At least we think. It's kind of hard to check up on this kind of stuff. This mission was notable for 2 reasons. 1, hello Luxembourg, and 2, it was the first private probe to successfully fly by the moon. In 2019, the Israeli Space Agency tried to send a lander, Bereshit, to the moon, and while it technically did reach the lunar surface, it wasn't in the way that they had hoped. The spacecraft, named after the first book of the Bible, suffered a failure of one of its gyroscopes during descent. Without the gyroscope, the spacecraft couldn't orient itself properly and crashed into the lunar surface. NASA's Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter actually snapped a gruesome picture of the event. In 2019, the Indians got another orbiter around the moon, but their attempt at a lander and rover didn't quite make it, unfortunately. More recently, other countries have sent flybys, orbiters, and landers, including South Korea, some more from Japan, the European Space Agency, Russia, Mexico, Pakistan, and the United Arab Emirates, with the usual mix of successes and failures, which is to say, a lot of failures. For example, in 2022, the Hakuto-R mission, led by JAXA and including a rover developed by the United Arab Emirates, had a software bug that prevented it from accurately gauging its altitude from the lunar surface. Eventually, its altitude did reach 0, but not in a good way. But still, no humans. It's hard to overstate just how much more difficult crewed missions to the moon are compared to robotic spacecraft. So far, only the United States and China have at least somewhat plausible plans for getting humans to the lunar surface in any somewhat plausible timeline. So what are these other nations and agencies left to do?
Discuss the possibility of opening a portal to Earth 2.
Can we put a pin in that, Switzerland?
Pick a side, that's what.
China has money. Does anybody want some?
Both nations have opened up their lunar programs to any partners willing to sign on and follow the rules. This can go anywhere from a paid rideshare situation like, hey, we'll give you a fraction of our payload capacity in exchange for some cold hard cash, to deals to co-develop critical mission parts. On the NASA side, the Artemis project includes the European Space Agency, JAXA, the German Aerospace Center, the Italian Space Agency, the Israeli Space Agency, the Canadian Space Agency, and the space program of Dubai. In addition to that, NASA is out there in the world trying to get as many people as possible to sign on to the Artemis Accords, which is an update to the 1967 Outer Space Treaty that allows for countries to use the moon for more than just looking around, as in mining it to make money, but still have everybody get along and not start any moon wars. So far, 43 countries have signed the accords, including Mexico, Canada, most South American countries, a good chunk of Europe, India, and Australia. The accords state that they are, quote, principles for cooperation in the civil exploration and use of the moon, Mars, comets, and asteroids for peaceful purposes. Note the exception of the outer planets, so if you want to have your space wars, that's where they need to be. One notable exception to the Artemis Accords? That's right, China and Russia. So 2 notable exceptions who, unsurprisingly, aren't so keen on a plan that essentially relies on trusting the United States. In 2021, those 2 countries started their own party. No, not a communist party, a space party called the International Lunar Research Station. which at first glance is about co-creating a long-term lunar base. But since that's decades away, it's really more about creating a counterweight to the Artemis Accords. And since then, they've got many other nations to sign on to their plans as well, including Azerbaijan, Belarus, Egypt, Nicaragua, Serbia, Pakistan, South Africa, Thailand, Venezuela, Kazakhstan, and Senegal. Thank you, Senegal. I'm not sure what you're going to contribute, but we're glad to have you on board. The Artemis project is always going to be led by American astronauts, and I'm sure that if China makes it back to the moon first, they're going to make sure it's one of their citizens to take that first step. But as plans develop and partners make their bids to be more valuable, you never know who might get to ride along and plant a flag of their own. But wait, there's more. If you want to get in on the moon action yourself, you need to spend an enormous amount of resources developing, creating, testing, and deploying a variety of spacecraft and technologies. All you need for that is money. Lots of money. For decades, the only entities with enough green in their checking accounts were large governments or multinational consortia. But nowadays, we have some absurdly wealthy and absurdly motivated individuals who have stars in their eyes and designs on space missions of their own. Take, for example, Jared Isaacman, who otherwise would have been just another random billionaire, except for the fact that he has privately financed, out of his own fortune, the Polaris program, which included the recent successful first ever spacewalk by a private astronaut, Jared Isaacman.
Happy to pay the bills.
And it wasn't just any spacewalk, it was the highest altitude orbital flight since the Gemini program. The mission launched on September 10th, 2024, and it wasn't through NASA or JAXA or Roscosmos, it was with SpaceX, aboard one of that company's Crew Dragon spacecraft launched with a Falcon 9 rocket. Isaacman, along with his crew of 3 others, underwent extensive training and preparation for the mission, not much different than the rigorous program that NASA puts its own astronauts through. That mission was a huge success, setting a new record for the number of people simultaneously exposed to vacuum, although the primary reason for that being that the Dragon capsule doesn't have a proper airlock. So to perform the spacewalk, the entire capsule has to be opened up and exposed to space. So it's not like the record was set on purpose, it was a limitation of the design of the spacecraft, but hey, a record is a record. And since there are no laws in space, just a loose set of international agreements that governments sorta follow, at least for now, as long as it doesn't get in the way of future plans, if you want to follow in Jared's footsteps and you've got enough money to finance your dreams, you can do it too. So perhaps the first person to return to the moon since the Apollo era will be some random rich person who just figured out how to do it themselves. Think I'm crazy? Think again. We've already sent a privately developed lander to the moon, Intuitive Machines' Odysseus lander, which, while it tipped over sideways as it landed, it still survived and sent data back. Firefly Aerospace hopes to send the Blue Ghost lander this November, launched from a SpaceX Falcon 9, followed in December by the iSpace, a Japanese company, rover mission. Intuitive Machines isn't done yet, and they hope to try again early next year, this time hopefully with the lander that, sticks the landing. Then there's Astrobotic, Blue Canyon Technologies, Draper Astrolab, and more. While any one single company may not be able to compete with the resources of an entire nation, it's not out of the realm of possibility that a consortium or partnership could do the trick. Just look at the Polaris mission, for example. Isaacman didn't build the rocket or spacecraft himself, but he did finance the development of just about everything else, including the extravehicular activity suits, laser communication systems, and more. Heck, since the current Artemis program itself calls for a private company to develop the human landing system to get people onto the lunar surface, technically, if that program succeeds, it will be SpaceX or Blue Origin's, not a NASA-built craft, that will be the first to deliver astronauts to the moon since Apollo. And it makes one think. What if we just skipped the whole SLS part of Artemis? Both SpaceX and Blue Origins are developing heavy and super heavy lift vehicles. Both of them are developing human landing systems for getting on and off the moon. All of these endeavors are funded in large part by NASA anyway. Does NASA really need its own rocket anymore? Of course, now that I think about it, that might be NASA's ultimate backup plan. Even if the SLS program fails and the Artemis project never delivers an astronaut to the moon, we'll still have the capability to do it anyway, and it just might be a private individual, a civilian, who puts the right money together to make it happen. In the end, we're returning to the moon, one way or another. And whether it's Artemis, Chang'e, or a billionaire hitching a ride on Starship, we're all going to win. Who do you think will be the first to return to the moon? Well, let me know in the comments. Thank you for watching, and thank you for sharing your time and space with me today.